It was a rainy October night in Charleston, South Carolina. The kind of night where the streets glisten with wet reflections and the air smells like old brick and river mist. Richard Hale, a 57-year-old real estate mogul, sat alone in his historic mansion on King Street, nursing a glass of scotch as the storm rumbled in the distance. His home, a grand colonial estate once featured in architectural magazines, now felt cold and hollow, more like a museum than a place of living. Since his wife Claire died 3 years ago in a tragic car accident on Ravenel Bridge, nothing had been the same. The laughter had faded, the art she once loved now gathered dust, and the silence was the only thing that kept him company at night. Around 12:03 a.m., the silence broke. Richard's private emergency line rang, an old rotary-style phone installed years ago for security, rarely used, and connected only to local authorities and his estate's emergency dispatch system. Confused, he picked up. Static filled the line, and for a moment he thought it was a prank or some technical glitch. But then he heard it. A soft voice, breathless, distant, whispered, "Richard, help me." His hand froze. The voice continued, slightly clearer. "I'm cold. I'm here. Still here." He gripped the phone tighter, his pulse thudding in his ears. "Who is this?" he asked, trying to sound firm. But deep down, something inside him cracked. That voice, it couldn't be. It sounded just like Claire. Her gentle tone, the slight lilt at the end of her words. It was impossible, but unmistakable. The call ended as abruptly as it had begun. Just a click. No goodbye. No number to trace. Richard stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, as if waiting for her to speak again. For nearly 10 minutes, he didn't move. Finally, as the thunder boomed outside, he placed the receiver back down and stumbled into the study. He opened the drawer where he kept her old voicemails saved on a USB stick. He plugged it into his laptop, scrolling to the last message Claire had left him just hours before she died. He played it, then replayed the new recording from the emergency line. The resemblance was chilling. Not similar. Identical. By 1 a.m., Richard had called both the local police and his private security firm. The call had come from an unregistered number, but was traced to a nearby public relay tower, one that serviced the area near Magnolia Cemetery, where Claire was buried. Richard's heart sank. That place had always haunted him. Claire hadn't wanted to be buried there. It was too eerie, she once said. But her family insisted, claiming it was where generations of her ancestors rested. He'd gone along with it, numb with grief at the time. Now, the thought of that call coming from her gravesite sent a chill down his spine. Unable to sit still, he threw on his coat, grabbed a flashlight and his car keys, and headed out into the storm. The roads were slick, wind pushing branches across the lanes. As he approached the cemetery gates, he noticed they were slightly ajar. He parked outside, leaving his headlights on, and entered through the rusted archway. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way through rows of old tombstones, many leaning or cracked with time. The rain had stopped, but the mist remained, curling around the statues like fingers. Claire's grave was near the old chapel ruins at the back of the cemetery. As he approached, he stopped dead in his tracks. Fresh roses, deep red, laid neatly across her grave. He hadn't been there in over a month, and no one else ever came. Her parents had moved out of state, and she had no siblings. He knelt, touched the petals. Still damp, not from rain, but as if placed just moments ago. Suddenly, behind him he heard it. A soft, whimpering sound, like a woman crying. He turned, flashlight trembling in his hand, scanning the trees and tombs. Nothing. Then, from the shadows, the whisper came again. Richard, his blood froze. The sound didn't come from a phone this time. It came from the dark, echoing faintly, almost as if the trees were carrying her voice. He backed away, tripping slightly on the uneven ground, nearly dropping the flashlight. He wanted to call out, but fear gripped his throat. The sound stopped. Silence. Only the sound of his own ragged breath remained. Shaken, he returned to his car, locking the doors as soon as he got in. He sat there for minutes, staring at the cemetery gates, now fully closed. Had he shut them? He couldn't remember. Back at the mansion, Richard poured another drink with trembling hands. The voice, Claire's voice still rang in his ears. He played both recordings again, analyzing every syllable. Same tone, same pauses, same breath. The only difference was the words. She was calling out for help, as if she hadn't found peace, as if something had been left undone. He reached for her old journals, stored in the attic. Perhaps they held answers. Perhaps, in death, Claire had found a way to speak truths she couldn't in life. What had really happened the night she died? He'd never questioned it, until now. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. The next morning, sunlight barely pierced the heavy gray clouds still hanging over Charleston, as if the storm had left behind a permanent bruise on the city. Richard Hale hadn't slept. The call, the voice, the visit to Magnolia's cemetery, it all replayed in his head like a loop he couldn't escape. His Scotch glass was untouched from the night before, condensation dripping down the sides. He sat in the drawing room with his laptop, headphones on, analyzing the recordings again. Every breath, every pause, every subtle rise in pitch in the voice from the 911 call mirrored Claire's. Not just similar, identical in rhythm and tone. Richard knew voices. Over the years, he'd sat through dozens of court cases over real estate disputes, heard expert testimony on forensics and voice authentication. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone, or something, was imitating Claire with chilling precision. By mid-morning, he drove out to James Island, where an old acquaintance lived. Bo Mitchell, a retired audio engineer who had worked with the local police department on voice analysis for criminal cases. Bo had once helped track down a scammer impersonating a missing person through voice messages, and Richard knew if anyone could give him honest, technical feedback, it would be him. Bo greeted him with raised eyebrows. "Didn't expect to see you here, Hale. You look like you saw a ghost." Richard didn't laugh. He simply handed him a USB drive and said, "Tell me if this voice is real, or if I'm losing my mind." They sat in Bo's soundproof studio, surrounded by dusty speakers, tangled cables, and yellowing acoustic panels. Bo played the two files, Claire's last voicemail and the mysterious 911 call, back to back. Then he played them on loop, slowed them down, and ran them through a waveform comparison software. Minutes turned into an hour. Finally, Bo leaned back and took off his headphones. It's the same voice. Every vowel dip, every breath length, even her slight lisp on S sounds. It's her. "I can't fake this, Hale. But there's no cell signature on this call. It's like it came from nowhere. It bounced between 3 towers, all near the cemetery. No phone ID, no SIM, no metadata. I've seen calls like this in criminal forensics, usually burner phones or voice over internet. But this is cleaner than even military spoof tech." Richard's skin crawled. "So what are you saying?" Bo looked at him, eyes squinting. "I'm saying either someone went to extreme lengths to copy your dead wife's voice using high-end AI and hacker-level spoofing, or Claire called you." There was no sarcasm in his voice, just quiet disbelief. Richard didn't respond. On the drive back to Charleston, he couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror. He felt watched, not by a person, but by a memory that refused to stay buried. That night, sleep came in patches. Around 3 a.m., the power in the mansion flickered. His bedroom light dimmed, then surged back to life. The thermostat reset itself, showing a temperature of 43 degrees Fahrenheit, an impossibly low setting for his system. Claire always used to complain about the cold. He remembered their arguments over keeping the room warm, her delicate fingers always wrapped around a cup of tea. Now, the cold was back, and no one had touched the settings. The next day, he reached out to the only person who had always believed in things beyond logic, his late wife's childhood friend, Margot Payne, who now lived in Asheville, North Carolina. Margot had once claimed she saw her father's spirit weeks after his funeral, and had spoken openly at Claire's funeral about energy that lingers. She had always been considered eccentric, even by Claire. But Richard was past caring how it sounded. He needed answers, not explanations. Margot agreed to meet him halfway at a small lodge in Columbia. She looked older than he remembered, gray streaks in her hair, heavy makeup, but her eyes were sharp. After hearing the story, she said something that made Richard's stomach churn. Claire always believed she wouldn't make it past her 50th birthday. Said she had dreams about water, bridges, and calling out to someone she loved and not being heard. Richard stared at her, speechless. She told you this? Margot nodded. A few weeks before she died, actually. She told me she felt like someone had unfinished business with her. That maybe her death wouldn't be the end. Richard's hands trembled as he reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was Claire's wedding ring. After the accident, her body had been cremated, but the ring had been recovered from the crash. He never parted with it. But now, he handed it to Margot. I need you to take this, he said, and see if she wants to tell us anything. Margot placed the ring in her palm, closed her eyes, and sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. When she opened them again, tears streamed down her cheeks. She's cold. She's not at rest. And she's waiting for you. Richard could barely breathe. Margot continued. She says the truth was never buried with her. She says someone knows. That night, Richard drove back home in a daze. He opened Claire's old piano bench, where she used to hide little love notes and souvenirs. Beneath a stack of sheet music, he found an envelope he didn't recognize. Inside were 3 photographs. One was of Claire standing on the edge of Ravenel Bridge a week before her death, taken from a distance. Another showed a bottle of medication, prescription sedatives, placed on her nightstand. The third was a receipt for a large life insurance payout, processed just 2 days after her death. But it wasn't in his name. It was made to someone named Daniel Groves. Richard had never heard of him. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. For the next 2 days, Richard couldn't shake the name Daniel Groves from his mind. He searched his memory over and over again, trying to place the name with a face, a conversation, anything. But it rang hollow. No recollection, no trace. The man had never been mentioned in any of Claire's stories. No photographs, no social media hints. And yet, there it was, a neatly printed receipt from a private insurer out of Atlanta, showing a wire transfer to Daniel Groves just 48 hours after Claire's death. What disturbed Richard the most was that the insurance provider was not one he recognized. It wasn't part of any policy Claire had ever discussed with him. In fact, their joint policies were handled exclusively through their Charleston attorney. This one was separate, private, hidden. He drove to the insurance company's branch in Atlanta the next morning, a 4-hour drive that felt like it stretched into eternity. The building was modern but unassuming, tucked between a strip mall and a bank off Peachtree Street. Inside, everything looked sterile. Gray carpeting, white walls, a quiet receptionist who barely looked up as he entered. Richard handed over the receipt and asked to speak with someone about the transaction. After a wait that felt intentionally long, a middle-aged man named Dennis Vaughn, with a receding hairline and clipped tone, appeared. He read the receipt twice, then looked at Richard, brow furrowed. "This account is not public," he said, "and I can't disclose any client information without court approval." Richard leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "That woman was my wife. She died in a car crash that left her body unrecognizable. If someone took a policy out on her without my knowledge and got paid within 2 days of her death, then I want to know who they are." Now, Dennis hesitated. Then, without speaking, he stood up and walked into the back office. When he returned, he handed Richard a file folder. "This didn't come through our public policy channels," he said. "It was an offshore premium plan, registered through a third-party broker. The name on the beneficiary account was Daniel Groves, but the policyholder name was Claire Hale." Richard opened the file. It contained scanned documents. One of them was Claire's digital signature, dated 8 months before the accident. There was a blurry scanned copy of her driver's license and an application filled out online. Everything seemed in order, except she had listed her marital status as separated. The feeling in Richard's gut turned from confusion to nausea. Claire had never mentioned being separated. They had occasional arguments like any couple, but she'd never even left their home for more than a few days at a time. The file listed a contact number and a mailing address for Daniel Groves. The address was in Savannah, Georgia. Richard drove there that same evening, eyes scanning every street sign, pulse quickening as he approached the listed apartment building. A small, peeling brick complex with flickering lights and overgrown hedges. Unit 3B was on the second floor. He climbed the stairs and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. As he turned to leave, an elderly woman from the next unit poked her head out. "If you're looking for Danny," she said, "he moved out about 2 months ago. Never gave a forwarding address. Left in the middle of the night with a woman. Blonde. Looked sick." A chill ran through Richard. "Did you get her name?" The woman shook her head. "Didn't ask, but she looked familiar. Thought I saw her on TV once. Maybe in a news report." Richard thanked her and left, but the words followed him like ghosts on the wind. Looked sick, familiar, news report. That night, back at his Charleston home, he did something he had avoided for months. He opened the folder labeled Crash Evidence in his study drawer. Inside were the accident photos, ones the police had shown him when the car was pulled from a bridge. Claire's belongings, her scarf, the twisted wreckage of the Volvo. But now he looked with new eyes. There were inconsistencies. The driver's side airbag hadn't deployed. The coroner's report never identified Claire's body by DNA, only by dental records and belongings found at the scene. Her body had been cremated within 48 hours, at her own previously requested instructions, supposedly. But Richard had never seen that request in writing. In fact, Claire had always said she wanted to be buried beside her parents in New Hampshire. He called a private investigator that night. Not just anyone, but someone he had worked with years ago during a lawsuit involving employee fraud. Nina Talbot, a former NYPD detective now running her own firm out of Raleigh. Within 24 hours, Nina was in Charleston, sitting across from Richard with a cup of black coffee and a notepad. He handed her the receipt, the photographs, and the scanned documents from the insurance company. "Find him," Richard said. "Find Daniel Groves, and tell me if my wife is dead or alive." Nina got to work immediately, and by the next evening, she had uncovered several interesting pieces. Daniel Groves had once worked as a hospital orderly in Savannah. He had no criminal record, but his social media history suggested he had been in a relationship with a woman named Claire B., a profile that had gone inactive shortly after the accident. One of the last tagged photos showed them together at a dock in Tybee Island. The timestamp? For days before Claire's supposed death. Richard stared at the photo. It was grainy, and the woman's face was turned slightly, but the hair, the posture, the way she held her coffee cup, it was Claire, or someone who looked exactly like her. By the end of the week, Nina had tracked Daniel's most recent credit card transaction to a gas station in Raleigh. She pulled the CCTV footage. A man matching Daniel's description filled up a car, a black Ford Fusion. A woman stepped out from the passenger side. The camera wasn't clear, but her profile was unmistakable. Claire. Same eyes, same walk, same nervous glance toward the camera before slipping back into the car. The timestamp on the footage was from just 3 days ago. Richard watched the video over and over again, unable to speak. Claire was alive, or at least someone who looked and moved like Claire, which meant the crash was staged, which meant the voice on the 911 call wasn't some glitch or cruel prank. It was her, reaching out, trying to be found. But why now? Why from the cemetery? Why the cold air, the whispers, the piano keys he swore had been played by invisible hands? Richard didn't know, but for the first time in months, he had a direction. He had evidence. He had questions that demanded answers. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. The next morning, Richard woke with a heaviness in his chest that made it hard to breathe. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure whether he was chasing the truth or being chased by it. He spent most of the morning pacing his study, staring at the paused frame on his computer screen. Claire's profile at that Raleigh gas station, her body half-turned, lips slightly parted, as if she had just said something before disappearing into the Ford Fusion. He watched it again and again until he no longer saw her face, but only the gaps in his memory, the strange silences during their last weeks together. The night she'd claimed to be visiting her sister in Asheville, the moment her eyes seemed distant, distracted. Now every innocent detail felt like a clue he had failed to notice. Nina called around noon. Her voice was calm, but serious, the kind of tone that hinted at something deeper than she was letting on. "I ran the plates on the Fusion. It was registered under a fake name, but the DMV address traces back to a P.O. box in Wilmington, North Carolina. That's not the only thing. I also ran a background check on Daniel Groves. 6 years ago, he was treated at a psychiatric facility in Roanoke. Diagnosed with dissociative episodes, potential for manipulation, and brief delusions of grandeur. He got out, disappeared for a while, and reemerged in Savannah 3 years ago. That's when he started dating someone by the name of Claire Benson. Richard felt the name hit him like cold water. "Benson?" he asked. "Not Hale." Nina hesitated. That's where it gets strange. There's no official record of a Claire Benson before 3 years ago. No birth certificate. No social security trace. But the face matches. I've run the DMV photo from your wife's license against the gas station footage. 97% match. Richard, either she created a new identity with someone's help, or someone created one for her. Later that day, Richard drove to Wilmington. The drive gave him time to reflect on the woman he had loved, or thought he had loved. The woman who held his hand during his heart attack scare. The one who cried watching old movies, who decorated the Christmas tree with military precision, who had written him a birthday card every year with exactly 3 paragraphs and a different quote at the end. Could she really have faked her death? Left everything behind, including him, for someone else? Or had she been forced, manipulated by a man with a history of mental instability? The questions tore at him, each one sharper than the last. Wilmington was quiet when he arrived. The post office was a simple brick building on Front Street. Inside, he posed as a legal representative and used the number on the P.O. box to request records of the holder's identity. After some hesitation and a fabricated legal threat, the manager handed over a scanned copy of the rental application. The name was once again Claire Benson. The signature, however, looked identical to Claire Hale's. He took a photo and forwarded it to Nina. That night, he checked into a small hotel near the Cape Fear Riverwalk. He couldn't sleep, so he walked along the water, the air cool and still, the sky overcast and heavy. He watched the ripples of the river moving slowly, and for a moment he thought he heard her laugh, soft and fleeting, carried on the breeze. He turned, heart racing. Nothing, just the sound of distant waves against the pier. The next morning, Nina called again. "I have something," she said. "There's a storage facility outside of Wilmington. Someone with the name Claire Benson rents a unit there. Paid 6 months in advance. I've already arranged a visit for us. We meet the manager at noon." By noon, Richard stood in front of Unit 47 at River Edge Storage, a faded blue metal door with rusting corners. The manager unlocked it and stepped back. The moment the door slid up, a wave of scent hit him. Dust, paper, a faint trace of perfume he hadn't smelled in almost a year. The unit wasn't large, but it was packed. Boxes stacked neatly, some labeled with dates and names. One was marked Charleston Sich, another read Photos Maine. Richard opened the first box and found a bundle of letters. His own handwriting on several envelopes. Claire had kept every note he had ever written her, from their dating years to recent birthday cards. Underneath, he found framed photos, him and Claire at Niagara Falls, at a vineyard in Napa, walking a trail in the Smoky Mountains. If she had wanted to disappear completely, why keep these? Nina opened another box and froze. Inside were medical documents. Claire's name, lab results, ultrasounds. She was pregnant, Nina said quietly. Richard stared at the paper. A due date had been circled in red ink, October 6th. The child would have been born months after her death, but there had never been any mention of a pregnancy. He hadn't known. Had she planned to tell him? Had she planned to raise the child with someone else? He stepped back, mind reeling. His phone buzzed. It was a blocked number. He answered. Silence. Then a soft, breathy voice, almost a whisper. "Stop looking, Richard. Please. Let go." It was her, Claire. And then the line went dead. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. Richard stood frozen in the storage unit, the silence around him almost deafening after the call. He replayed the voice in his mind. It wasn't just similar to Claire's. It was hers. There was a tremble in it, not of fear, but of pleading. She didn't sound like a woman in distress or danger. She sounded like someone trying to protect something or someone. He looked back at the ultrasound photo Nina still held in her hand. A due date that had long passed. A child that may or may not have been born. He pressed the phone against his ear again, hoping for a callback, but there was nothing but the dull hum of the disconnected line. His hand was shaking now. "Did you record that?" Nina asked. He shook his head. It was too fast. Nina swore under her breath, then looked back at the boxes. "She's watching you. Somehow, somewhere. She knows you're getting close." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Richard and Nina gathered as much as they could from the unit. Copies of documents, photos, a worn journal that Claire had kept. It didn't take everything. Richard insisted on leaving things where they were, as if disturbing them too much might somehow scare her further into hiding. That evening, they returned to the hotel, and Richard sat alone by the window, reading through her journal page by page. It started 3 years before her death, on a quiet autumn day in Asheville. She wrote about the loneliness that crept in even as her life with Richard grew more comfortable. She mentioned needing to find herself, to escape the expectations everyone had of her. She never directly mentioned Daniel Groves, but there were veiled references, a man who understood silence, who didn't ask her to pretend. There were entries about guilt, about secrets she feared would destroy Richard, and one entry dated only 2 months before her supposed death that simply read, "He'll never forgive me, but I have no choice. I have to go." The next morning, Nina knocked on his door with a folder in her hand. "You're going to want to sit down for this," she said. I traced the number from the call. It pinged a cell tower in a remote part of the Croatan National Forest, just outside New Bern. I called in a favor. There's a cabin on a private lot near that location. Guess who the utilities are registered to? She paused, then added Claire Benson. Paid in cash. For the past 14 months. Richard didn't hesitate. He packed a bag, and within 2 hours, he and Nina were driving south through the winding roads toward New Bern, the tension thick between them. He kept thinking of what he would say to her, what questions he'd ask if he found her. Would he scream? Cry? Or would he simply stare, unable to reconcile the woman he buried with the one who whispered to him from the other side of a phone line? The forest closed in around them as they drove deeper into the trees. The GPS signal flickered, unreliable. By the time they reached the gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the dense pine. The house came into view slowly, small, wooden, with faded green shutters and a wraparound porch. It looked abandoned at first glance, but as they stepped out of the car, Richard noticed something. A curtain shifted in the upstairs window. He raised a hand, heart hammering against his chest. "Claire," he called. No answer. Nina moved toward the porch, her hand subtly resting near the pistol at her hip. "Let me knock," she said. But before she could reach the door, it creaked open slowly. No one stood there, just the dark hallway beyond, quiet as a tomb. Richard stepped forward and entered. The smell of pine wood and old coffee lingered. The kitchen light was on, and there was a half-finished cup on the counter. Someone had been there recently. Upstairs, a door creaked. He climbed slowly, each step groaning under his weight. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was empty. Then, at the end, he saw her, standing in the doorway of a bedroom, wearing a pale gray sweater and jeans, her hair longer, slightly darker, but her face unmistakable. "Claire, alive, real. You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Richard couldn't speak. He felt the floor fall from under him, the weight of months of grief collapsing in an instant. Why, he finally managed. Why all of this? Why fake your death? Claire looked over his shoulder, saw Nina standing behind him, and stepped back into the room. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't plan for it to go this far." She glanced at a crib in the corner. Richard followed her gaze and saw the child. A boy, barely walking with his eyes. His eyes. "Is he mine?" Richard asked. She nodded silently. Nina didn't speak. She stood in the doorway, eyes narrowed, absorbing everything. Claire walked to the crib, picked up the child, and turned to face them both. "Daniel was dangerous. I didn't know it when I met him. By the time I did, it was too late. He became obsessed. He found out about the pregnancy. He threatened to hurt me, hurt you. Faking my death was the only way I could protect the baby and you. Richard tried to hold onto the fury he'd brought with him, but it crumbled in his chest. The betrayal, the grief, all of it mixed with something new. Relief. You should have told me, he said. I didn't trust anyone anymore, she replied. Not after what Daniel did. I couldn't even go to the police. I thought disappearing was the only way out. There was a long silence before Nina finally spoke. We need to make this right. If Daniel's still out there, you're not safe. None of you are. Claire nodded. He doesn't know where I am. But if he finds out you've seen me, her voice trailed off. Richard turned toward the window. The forest outside had gone quiet. Too quiet. Richard barely slept that night. The child, his son, slept peacefully in the crib in the corner of the cabin while Claire rested on a cot near the window, her eyes fluttering open at every creak of the old house. Outside, the wind passed through the pines with a low moan, and every shadow seemed to shift like it was hiding someone just out of view. Richard sat at the kitchen table with Nina, both of them whispering under their breath, trying to make sense of everything. We can't just leave her here, Nina said, sipping a lukewarm coffee. If this Daniel guy is half as dangerous as she says, then staying put is a death sentence. You saw the way she flinched when the floorboard creaked. She's living like prey. Richard nodded slowly, staring at the framed photo on the table. A picture of Claire holding the baby, both of them smiling at some unseen person behind the camera. It didn't look staged. It looked like a real life, one that had existed without him. We can't go to the police yet, he murmured. Not without proof. Not without knowing if Daniel is still out there. Nina tapped her phone. I've already started looking. His name isn't tied to anything recent, but that doesn't mean he's not watching. Claire said he used burner phones. Fake IDs. We might be dealing with someone who's done this before. As the sun broke over the treetops, Claire joined them at the table, her face pale but resolute. We can't stay here, she said before either of them could speak. This place was only ever temporary. I've moved 4 times in the past 2 years. I thought I lost him, but if he even suspects you've found me, she broke off, glancing toward the stairs, as if the child could hear. Richard reached for her hand. Then we move now. I'll protect you. Both of you. It was the first time he'd said it, acknowledged the boy as his. Claire's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded, brushing them away before the child could come toddling into the kitchen, unaware of the fear that hung in the air like smoke. They packed in silence, loading the car just after dawn. Nina insisted on using a back route toward Wilmington, where she had a contact, a retired federal marshal named Ben Holloway, who might be able to help. The road twisted through thick forest. The signal dropped entirely for miles, and Richard kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting a shadowy vehicle to appear behind them. Claire sat in the back with the baby, softly humming a lullaby to keep him calm. It was the same tune she used to hum while folding laundry in their old home in Asheville. The familiarity of it sent a pang through Richard's chest, like something torn had begun to mend but still bled a little with each breath. When they reached Wilmington by mid-afternoon, Ben met them in the parking lot of a rundown diner just off U.S. Route 17. He was a thick-set man in his 60s, gray beard, eyes sharp like a hawk that had seen too many winters. This is bigger than just a jealous boyfriend, he said after hearing Claire's story. Daniel Groves isn't just some obsessive lunatic. I've heard that name before. Small-time enforcer for a crew out of Raleigh. Disappeared off the radar after a shootout back in 2017. If he's resurfaced, it's not because of the kid. It's because he's hiding something. Claire leaned forward. You think he's afraid of what I know? Ben shrugged. People like him don't leave witnesses. Especially not ones who disappear in the middle of the night with something or someone that might tie him to a crime. They agreed to move Claire and the baby to a safe house owned by one of Ben's friends near the Cape Fear River. It wasn't fancy, but it was secure. Metal shutters, reinforced doors, cameras on all sides. Nina stayed behind to dig deeper into Daniel's records while Richard and Claire settled into the new space. It was the first time in almost 2 years they had sat together in silence that wasn't filled with grief or fear. They talked late into the night about everything they'd missed, Claire's decision to vanish, The day she cried herself to sleep holding the baby, the guilt she carried like a second skin. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said softly, her head resting on Richard's shoulder. "But I never stopped loving you. I never stopped hoping you'd find me." Richard didn't speak. He just held her hand and stared at the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware that his world had just begun to tilt. But peace never lasted. The next morning, Nina called with news that shattered the fragile calm they had begun to build. She had managed to trace a call made by Daniel Groves 2 days ago. It was placed from a gas station just 20 minutes from the cemetery in Asheville, the same night Richard got the 911 call. "He knows," she said bluntly. "He's playing with you. With all of us." That voice on the call? He made her say it. "I think he's watching everything. Tracking her. Maybe even listening in on us." Richard stood frozen, the phone pressed to his ear. Claire's face had drained of color, and she clutched the baby tightly as he began to cry, sensing the tension. "What do we do now?" Richard asked. Nina didn't hesitate. "Now we trap him. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends." The wind picked up along the banks of the Cape Fear River as Richard stood outside the safe house, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. The water glittered under the late afternoon sun, deceptively calm, while inside, Claire rocked the baby to sleep with trembling arms. Every creak in the wooden floor felt like a warning, and every bird call made her flinch. Richard hadn't said much since Nina's call that morning, just enough to inform Claire and Ben that Daniel Groves had made contact, likely coerced the chilling message from her, and was now within reach. The idea of setting a trap felt dangerous, reckless even, but the truth was, running forever had stopped being an option the moment Richard heard his dead wife's voice from a cemetery payphone. Ben paced the living room like a man preparing for war. "You want to bring this guy out? You can't do it in hiding," he said finally. "He thinks he has power because he thinks she's alone, that no one's looking for her. We flipped the script. Let him believe she's making a new life, coming out of the shadows." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You mean bait?" Ben nodded. "Exactly, but controlled. We let word get out. Fake social media posts, a leaked photo, something to draw him out." Claire looked torn between fear and determination. "What if he hurts someone?" Ben met her eyes squarely. "That's why we control it. We pick the place. We surround it. He comes looking for you, and he finds us instead." Within 24 hours, Nina had crafted a digital trail. A carefully curated online profile for Clara H. appeared on several platforms, all hinting a new life near Wilmington. Posts showing sunsets by the river, a blurry picture of the baby at a playground, a half-obscured image of Claire standing by a cafe. It was subtle but deliberate, the kind of breadcrumbs a man like Daniel wouldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Richard installed additional cameras and reinforced the entry points of the safe house, while Ben coordinated with a few trusted law enforcement contacts who still owed him favors. No one mentioned the baby, but every movement and decision centered on keeping him safe. Days passed slowly. The first sign that their plan might be working came on the 5th night. A black SUV drove by the safe house at 2:13 a.m., headlights off. Richard saw it through the front window and instantly hit record on the outside camera. The vehicle didn't stop, didn't even slow, but it circled the block twice before disappearing down a side street. The plates were covered with mud. When he showed the footage to Ben, the old marshal grunted. "He's here. Now we wait." But Daniel didn't strike immediately. Over the next 3 days, signs of surveillance increased. Trash bins were rifled through. A neighbor's dog was found injured. Claire's laundry, hanging on a line behind the house, disappeared one afternoon while everyone was inside. Each incident chipped away at her composure, but she refused to leave. "He took everything from me once," she whispered to Richard on the 7th morning. "I won't let him take it again." Ben chose a spot for the confrontation, an abandoned boathouse near Greenfield Lake, once used by rowing clubs, now vacant and surrounded by trees thick enough to hide surveillance equipment. A single post was made on Claire's fake profile that afternoon, finally ready to reclaim a little peace. "Watching the water today made me feel like life's still possible." The location was subtly tagged. They set up that night. Claire was fitted with a hidden mic and told to walk the lakeside trail while the rest of the team, including two of Ben's former colleagues armed and in position, waited in concealed vehicles around the area. The baby stayed at the safe house with Nina and a private security guard. Claire's steps were slow and steady, her eyes scanning every movement in the trees. Richard, watching her through binoculars from a van across the lake, had to fight the instinct to rush out every time the wind moved a branch. It happened just before 9 p.m. Claire had paused near the boathouse, pretending to check her phone, when a figure emerged from the trees behind her, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie. Her body tensed, but she didn't move. The man stopped a few feet away. "Clara," he said. The voice wasn't loud, but it echoed in the stillness. "You've been busy." Richard's heart pounded as he listened through the earpiece. Claire turned slowly. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely audible. "Why are you here?" He stepped closer, and that's when Ben gave the signal. Lights flashed from all directions. Officers closed in. Daniel froze, his hands twitching toward his waist. Then he bolted, not toward the water, but straight into the woods. Richard was out of the van in seconds, chasing him with the others through thick underbrush and uneven trails. Daniel was fast, darting through the trees like a man who'd done it before, but Richard didn't let up. They caught him half a mile from the boathouse, near a fallen log, where he slipped and twisted his ankle. Guns drawn, the officers pinned him down. Richard arrived breathless, rage pulsing in his veins as he looked into the eyes of the man who'd turned his life into a nightmare. "You're done," he growled. Daniel spat at his feet, but said nothing. The officers dragged him away in cuffs, and just like that, the man who had haunted Claire's every breath for 2 years was gone. Back at the safe house, Claire cried as she held the baby, and for the first time, they were tears of relief. Richard wrapped his arms around her, and though neither of them spoke, everything between them felt understood. Safe didn't mean perfect. It didn't mean the past would vanish, but it meant a beginning, a real one. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. The courtroom was smaller than Richard had expected, tucked in the corner of the new Hanover County Courthouse in downtown Wilmington. The air inside was heavy with tension, though the case had not yet drawn media attention. Claire sat next to him, her hands clenched in her lap, eyes fixed on the defendant's chair. Daniel Groves sat there in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed in front of him, a thin smirk playing at the edge of his mouth as if none of this mattered. Richard's stomach turned at the sight of him. This man who had made their lives a hellscape for years, who had faked voicemails in Nina's voice, tampered with graves, and manipulated every sliver of fear until it became unbearable. But now the system had him in chains, and this preliminary hearing would determine if the case was strong enough to move to trial. Ben sat behind them, his wide frame settled into the bench like a stone wall of reassurance. He gave a single nod when Richard glanced back, a silent confirmation that they had done everything right so far. The prosecutor, a sharply dressed woman named Denise Hall, had spent days going over evidence. Audio recordings, GPS traces, surveillance video, and the testimony of Claire, Nina, and Richard himself. What they lacked in smoking gun footage, they made up for in overwhelming consistency. Daniel's presence near the cemetery where the 911 call originated, his use of burner phones, the manipulation of Claire's digital footprint, all of it built a narrative impossible to dismiss. When Claire took the stand, the entire room shifted. Her voice trembled only at first, but grew stronger with every word. She told the judge about the first months of abuse, the control Daniel had exerted over her money, her family, her very movement, how she had disappeared after his threats escalated, how Richard had helped her start over in secret, and how Daniel had hunted her anyway. She didn't cry, not even when she described the moment she saw him again in the woods by the lake. Richard watched her with awe. This woman who once trembled at every knock on the door was now staring down the man who had terrorized her, and he saw something shift inside her as she spoke, a reclaiming of self. The defense attorney tried to paint a different picture. Daniel had simply been trying to reunite with his wife, that he had no intention of harming her, that he was a heartbroken man who had made some poor decisions. But the judge didn't seem to be buying it. When the session adjourned, Daniel was denied bail. He would stay in custody until the trial. Outside, as the sun blazed over the courthouse steps, Claire exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. "That smirk," she muttered to Richard, "it's not going to last." In the following days, Claire and Richard began the slow process of rebuilding with a new kind of clarity. There were still precautions, security cameras stayed up, and the baby monitor was checked religiously, but the sense of impending danger had lifted. Claire resumed her therapy sessions, this time not just to cope with fear, but to unpack years of suppressed trauma. Richard returned to his office in Charlotte a few days a week, though he was now more interested in charity than profits. He'd quietly begun funding a program for domestic abuse survivors, offering legal support, emergency relocation, and, when possible, psychological counseling. "No one should have to do what we did to feel safe," he told Claire one evening over dinner, their son babbling beside them. But even as they settled into a routine, odd things continued to happen. One morning, Claire opened a letter addressed to Clara Hill, the fake name she had used online. It was unsigned, just a folded piece of paper with a single sentence: "You can't hide from everyone." The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the postmark showed a town 3 states away. It rattled her enough to call Ben, who drove down the next day. They couldn't prove it had come from Daniel. It was likely just an internet troll who had caught wind of the story, maybe a sympathizer who believed Daniel's sob story defense. Still, it reminded them both that even in cages, shadows had ways of creeping under doors. A week later, a break-in occurred at a women's shelter in Durham, one of the very locations Claire had stayed in when she first escaped. Nothing was taken, but Claire's old room was ransacked. Her stomach turned when the staff called her. "Do you think he knows people?" she asked Ben that night, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben scratched his chin, deep in thought. Daniel had money once. Contacts. Maybe he called in a favor. Maybe someone thinks they owe him. Or maybe someone just wants to finish what he started. Richard wasn't convinced it was over either. Something about Daniel's smirk in court haunted him. The certainty in it, like a man who knew a secret he hadn't yet revealed. They redoubled security. The baby was never left alone. Claire stopped posting anything online, even under aliases. They changed routes, changed habits, stayed unpredictable. But fear still crept in at night, long after the locks were bolted. Then, 2 nights before the trial date was officially confirmed, Richard's phone rang at 3:02 a.m. It was an unknown number. Against better judgment, he answered. Silence, then static, and then a whisper. "She still loves me, Richard. She told me herself." The voice was chillingly close to Daniel's, but it was warped, possibly distorted, as if filtered through software. Richard's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" he demanded. The line went dead. He called Ben immediately, who confirmed that Daniel hadn't made any calls from jail. "It was either a recording," Ben said grimly, "or someone who wants you to think he's still in control." The sense of closure they had begun to feel was shattered. But instead of falling apart, Claire and Richard did something unexpected. They leaned into each other more. They documented everything, reported everything, and continued to press forward. This time, they wouldn't be scared into silence. They had come too far to turn back. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like, and share with friends. The morning of the trial began like any other, yet the air in Wilmington was thick with anticipation. The courthouse loomed under a gray sky as Richard, Claire, and Ben arrived together. It had been months of relentless preparation, hours spent with attorneys, therapists, investigators, trying to build a case so airtight that even Daniel's twisted games couldn't unravel it. Claire held her head high as they walked through the metal detectors, her hand firmly wrapped around Richard's. No more disguises, no more hiding. This was the moment she would face him, not as a victim, but as a survivor determined to take her life back. Daniel sat with the same smug look he wore during the preliminary hearing, but there was something different in his eyes now. Uncertainty. His legal team had thinned, his supporters vanished, and the jail had left him pale and tired. Still, he tried to project confidence, but it faltered when Claire took the stand again. This time, her story was followed by forensic audio experts who testified about the digitally manipulated voicemails, how Daniel had combined old voice memos from Nina with AI software to recreate her tone, her inflection, even her pauses. Then came digital security analysts, presenting traces of burner phone purchases and the geo-coordinates that placed Daniel's devices near the cemetery, the lake, and a shelter in Durham. The turning point came when a former acquaintance of Daniel's, someone who once worked with him in a security firm, testified that Daniel had asked him years ago how to track someone without being traced. It was clear that this wasn't love. This was obsession, control, and psychological warfare. Richard watched Daniel's face closely. The smirk dissolved. His jaw tensed. By the time the closing arguments came, Daniel wouldn't even look at Claire. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts: stalking, harassment, digital impersonation, and unlawful surveillance. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison without the possibility of early release. A hush fell over the courtroom before a few scattered claps broke out. Claire didn't cry. Instead, she leaned into Richard's shoulder and whispered, "We're free." And for the first time, it truly felt like they were. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Richard found a calm they had never dared imagine. They moved to a new home just outside Asheville, North Carolina, a modest place nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by pine trees and winding roads. There were no smart devices, no digital assistants, no exposed online profiles. Claire planted a garden. Richard learned how to cook. Their son, now walking and babbling full sentences, filled the house with noise that reminded them of life, not fear. Nina's grave, once a source of grief layered in confusion, became a peaceful stop on their road trips. Richard often brought flowers there, whispering stories to her about the life he had built after her. One sunny afternoon, Claire joined him, holding their son in her arms. She knelt beside the headstone and said quietly, "Thank you for sending me him." It was a strange thing to say, but it felt right. Even after Daniel was locked away, shadows sometimes danced in their dreams. Richard would jolt awake at odd hours, convinced he heard that warped voice again. Claire would sometimes freeze if she saw an unfamiliar car parked outside too long. But those moments became fewer and further between. Therapy helped. Love helped more. They began speaking at women's centers and abuse recovery forums, sharing their story, not to relive the trauma, but to offer proof that healing was possible. That survival wasn't just escaping, it was learning how to live again. One fall afternoon, as the leaves painted the hills in shades of amber and gold, Richard received a letter from the Department of Corrections. Daniel had died. A fight in the prison yard, they said. A disagreement over a radio. The letter didn't say much else. There was a strange emptiness to it. Not quite relief, not quite sadness. Just the closing of a chapter. Richard showed the letter to Claire. She read it silently, then folded it and placed it in the back of a drawer they no longer opened. "He's really gone," she said after a long pause. Richard nodded. "Yes, but we're still here." They never tried to erase the past. It became part of their story, woven into who they were, but no longer defined them. Their lives were no longer shaped by fear or shadows. Instead, they built a life with meaning, a real one. Richard sold his remaining stake in the company and used the money to start a foundation for survivors of psychological abuse. Claire returned to school, pursuing a degree in counseling. Their son grew up watching his parents not just survive, but thrive. And whenever someone asked how they met, Claire would smile and say, "It's a long story. One day, maybe we'll tell you."